Because it's graduation season, there has been this image very much on my mind that I saw. It was a photo taken several years ago during the peak of all the national riots that were happening. And the photo depicts this young woman. She's just graduated high school. She's got her cap and her gown on, so she's ready to launch into the world. But behind her, the world, if you remember, is totally on fire. It was a time of total chaos, right? Windows were smashed, cars were flipped, buildings were lit up. And so on her face is this really convicting expression. It first sends the message of disappointment, right? She's worked so hard to get to this point, and now that she's ready to take on the world, there's no world left. But the other side of the expression sends this clear message. You did this. Now, I'm old enough to be her father. And so when I look at that photo, I have to admit, there's a sting of responsibility that hits every time. There's a part of me that says, you know what, she's kind of right. The world that I had inherited was one where doors were unlocked, manners were expected, crime was very low, and social tensions were mild. Is a far cry from the dumpster fire that, of course, she was receiving at the time. And so that raises the question then, well, what happened? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I was her age. How did we go from A all the way to F? And I know that that's a complex question, and there's a lot of answers that are part of that. But underneath all of those answers is a very simple one. And it's so simple that I think we miss it because it came up in the readings thematically, but it goes by so quick. I don't know that it really has the impact that it was intended to have. And so that's what I'm going to speak to right now. I want you to bear with me because it's going to require a little exegesis, but I promise you I'm going to circle back and we're going to answer this question. What do we see in the readings? The line that I'm going to zero in on is where in the first reading at Mount Sinai, so 50 days after they've had their Passover meal, the Israelites encounter God and he's recounting all the wonderful things he's done for them. And then he says to them a promise. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. What? Think about that for a second, because God doesn't waste words. In your mind, what does that mean to you right now if you had to explain that to somebody else? You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. It obviously matters because St. Peter's going to bring it up over 1,000 years later. He'll say in his New Testament letter, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And he's speaking to the church. It pops up again in the book of Revelation. We are made a kingdom, priests to our God. So obviously something matters. This is part of the plan. And I know for myself, when I think about that and I think of kings, I think, well, kings are those whose job it is to establish order and justice. And it's typical for them to live in a castle. Priests, it's their job to establish holiness. They sanctify things, and their dwelling place is properly a temple. And we view these things as very separate realities. But there actually was a time when those realities were united as one. And that time goes all the way back to the beginning in the garden. The Garden of Eden was not simply a political space where God intended society to thrive. The ancient Jews are very clear on this in their writings, that the garden was also the temple where God and man lived and loved in harmony. And Adam and Eve, as king priests, had the responsibility to govern that garden in right order, so that's the order and the justice, and to sanctify by orienting everything in that garden into right relationship with God. But that was a disaster, right? That didn't go so well. So since then, what we see is this increasing separation between those two offices, all the way until today, we have a very strong opinion in America of a radicalized separation between church and state, such that anything that even smells religious is immediately tossed out of the public sphere. But conversely, anytime I bring up the dignity of human life or God's plan for marriage from the pulpit, I'm almost immediately accused of being too political in the mass, which is meant to have nothing to do with any social issues. And that's wrong. That's actually a novel view. What we see Jesus doing in the gospel is he brings those offices back together. He is the Son of David, the heir to the royal throne. He's king with a capital K. But he's also the high priest. And so today, what's happening is this king priest, the ultimate version of itself, is looking out into the world. And this is how the gospel began today. And he's splagizomais, he's moved with compassion in his gut because he sees all the suffering. And whenever he splagizomais, he acts. It's a compassion that demands a response, and so he responds. And what's telling is that his response to the world's suffering is to restore the king-priest office. Now that might not seem as obvious to you, but what does it say that he does? He summons the 12, he calls each of them by name, and then he places them. He very specifically says, do not go to Samaria and the pagans. He puts them over the house of Israel. And then he gives them all this priestly authority. Cast out demons, anoint the sick, heal. So that's the priesthood. The kingly power here is that what he's doing is directly imitating King Solomon in the book of Kings chapter 4, who himself as a king calls 12 officers to himself. He names all 12 of them, and then he places them over the Israelites with this kind of kingly authority. And in doing so, Jesus is bringing to fulfillment God's promise at Sinai from the first reading, when God called all 12 tribes to himself and promised them, I will make you a kingdom of priests. And when Jesus does this, he's doing this as the church. You guys are doing great, even though your expressions are saying different. I just believe you're paying attention. We're almost there. We're landing the plane. Hang in there. So when we look at the office of king priest, while it might be most visible in our bishops because they have their staff and they have their mitre and all that, it's actually the church as a whole. It's both of us asked together because we are the church. I'm not the church. We are the church. And so we can now go back to that original question. What does anything of what I just said have to do with a young woman standing in her cap and gown in front of a world that is on fire? It means we're not doing our job. If the job of a king is to establish order and justice, and of a priest is to sanctify, how was that even possible for her? It means each of us, respective to our vocation, must govern the sliver of God's kingdom entrusted to our care in fidelity to God as an expression of our worship, so that where we are planted in our part of the vineyard, we are cultivating order and justice and holiness, the way that Adam and Eve were charged to do. But they didn't, and everything became a mess. And if that dumpster fire says anything to us, it says that things are a mess now. So what does that mean for us today? It means this: the time has come for Catholics to stop tolerating evil, to stop remaining idle when the serpent is in the vineyard, to return to God what belongs to God, whether that's by leaving the institutions whose values run contrary to our beliefs, as many families are doing already as they continue to pull out of public schools. It means speaking up against outrages like Catholics in California have been doing with the whole Dodger Stadium scandal with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who are blasphemous. And it also means proactively cultivating strong Catholic identities in our homes and in our children. Mother Teresa very famously said, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. Because for the laity, that's your temple, that's your castle. And you are responsible for keeping it the same way that you expect me to be responsible for keeping this parish. So that, should the enemy ever try to wiggle his way in, you expect me with vigilance, as I promise in front of the bishop with my oath of fidelity, to root it out. But that is also your charge. And when this doesn't happen, our Lord is grieved. Our Lord looks out, as he does in today's gospel, and he's splagizomais. He's gut-wrenched with compassion because chaos has won and the laborers are few. And our children inherit a world that is on fire. But it doesn't have to be that way. And there is no one else that God has sent to make the difference. We are the church, and it is our responsibility to fulfill this role.